Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm so happy that you are here. Today, we are at it with another episode in the Reclaiming What is Hard series, and we're going to talk about loneliness, a deep, unbearable ache of feeling so terribly alone. What can we do about it? How can we think about it so that we can begin to hold our aloneness a little bit differently? So let's get into it. Now, if you're new here, before I became a licensed psychotherapist, I was a depth-oriented coach for almost a decade. So I have seen, taught, and explored many ideas and concepts for how to navigate the complexities of being human. And so in this podcast, I hope to offer ways of thinking differently about popular concepts or popular experiences, so you can figure out what's going to be most supportive for you. Every episode, I reclaim one topic, and today I want to pick up for where I left off in my series that I am calling Reclaiming What is Hard. There are a lot of difficult parts of being human, and all of those things tend to revolve around feelings that arise within us that are hard to bear, feelings that we've never been taught to feel, feelings that we have been told are bad. Feelings that now, when they arise, overwhelm, paralyze, and collapses us. So in this series, I want to talk about, I want to break down some of these difficult feelings. I want to shed light on what they may mean. I want to explore different ways of thinking and relating to them so that you may find some wisdom in what is hard. There's this famous Buddhist quote that says, like, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And I sometimes take that to mean that and hard stuff will inevitably arise during our time here on this planet. But what we make of it, how we relate to it, can make a really big difference. So that's what this series is all about, expanding our ability to tolerate some difficult internal experiences by talking about it. And in this episode, we're going to talk about loneliness. And my goal here is for us to explore the roots of loneliness, not as a symptom to be fixed, but as a profound emotional experience with intrapsychic and relational meaning. Because listen, loneliness is something that I think we've all experienced at one point in time or another. Some of us have experienced it more than others. I recently, in the past year, have moved to a different county. So I'm in a kind of a new environment with new relationships, and I have found myself experiencing some pretty profound moments of loneliness. And it's been making me very curious over, like, what is this state? What is this experience of loneliness? How can we understand this feeling of loneliness so that it can take shape as something meaningful in our lives rather than something that's just like a problem that needs to be fixed? And, if we can think of loneliness as more than just about social isolation, right? Like, what if we were to think about it as an internal experience that is really connected with the quality of relationships, including the quality of relationship with oneself and unmet longings? What if loneliness was not just easily fixed by just going out and spending more time with people, but rather an internal experience that is deserving of some exploration and curiosity? So that's what we're here to kind of explore and break down together. And if we're going to talk about loneliness, of course, we have to first get clear on what is even this idea of loneliness and how does it differentiate from, for example, being alone or being in solitude. I tend to use the word solitude and aloneness and being alone as kind of the same thing, which to me means just being physically by ourselves. When we are alone, there's no one around us. When we are in solitude, when we're going hiking by ourselves, we are physically alone. And that is a little bit different from what I'm talking about here in terms of loneliness, because loneliness feels involuntary. Whereas maybe we find ourselves choosing to be alone, or we are finding ourselves wanting to be alone. That feels sometimes like a choice. Of course, sometimes it's not a choice to be alone. But loneliness doesn't feel like it's something that we are actively seeking out. Loneliness feels involuntary, and it carries a sense of rejection. It carries a sense of invisibility. It carries a sense of longing for some type of meaningful connection. Right? It's often woven with feelings of shame, of grief, of desire, of envy, of emptiness. a lot of times when I talk to people who share that they feel alone, the kind of feeling or the experience they're attempting to name is this sense of emptiness, that there's nothing good to hold on to inside of themselves, that they may have all sorts of relationships. They may have friends. They may have intimate partnerships. They may go to work every day, right? They're surrounded by people. And yet there is this unshakable emptiness, and kind of, an internal landscape that feels really void of something meaningful. And that type of loneliness is a very curious phenomenon. What is going on for us there when we feel like there's nothing good to hold on to? Oftentimes that's, as I said, it's connected with a sense of shame, that there's something broken in us. Why are we feeling alone in a crowded room? What could we be experiencing there? Loneliness is often talked about as a social problem, right? It's like something to fix with connection or better communication. If you were a better communicator, if you knew how to talk more about yourself or your feelings, you wouldn't feel so lonely. But psychoanalytic thinkers, I tend to want to think about it a little bit more deeply. That loneliness is not just about being alone. It's about the experience of not being with someone who can hold us in mind. There's something about someone else's mind holding us, that then leaves us feeling like we aren't as alone. It's about not feeling known in the mind of another. And I know that, what does all that mean? I'm going to break it down. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but I wanted to kind of shape it as, yes, there's a cultural component. Yes, there is a social element to it. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that could be manifesting for you. But also I tend to think of loneliness through a more psychoanalytic lens, which is a sense of like not really being held in mind, not really feeling known. Yeah. But before we go there, right, let us talk for a minute about the cultural piece, because capitalism and productivity encourages this culture of disconnection from self and others. And there are many kind of really brilliant thinkers out there who have spent way more time thinking about this than me. But I've been really interested in the thinkers who have been wondering about what happens when we lose communal spaces. What types of disconnection as a result of us not having spaces to just be together, these tiny kind of opportunities of coming together, sitting at a coffee shop, going to the library. These lack of community spaces can induce within us a deeper sense of feeling isolated and separate from people. Where do we go when we just want to be connected to people? The other kind of interesting theories and thinking that I've gravitated towards is this idea that capitalism actually benefits off of your isolation. If you don't have anyone to drive you to the airport, right, then you're going to have to take an Uber. You're going to have to pay for that service. That Uber driver is going to have to pay for their car and their gas. And that right there means that now we have one more demand, one more service rendered and given, as opposed to a family member driving you to the airport. Now there's more of this communal sharing of an experience. And there's more time together and less need for everyone to have their own separate vehicles. That capitalism and productivity culture really encourages disconnection from self and from other people. If we're operating in a silo, we're going to need more resources than if we share the pool of resources, right? And so if you need more resources, you're going to have to pay for it. So there's a way in which capitalism has really commodified relationships. It has, I think, in so many ways, created more of a transactional aspect to our relationships. And if we're all going to be so siloed, we're going to need more and more things to support us, as opposed to being able to share, being able to go to your neighbors and get a stick of butter. Now we're going to have to go to the store and get that butter. We can't talk about loneliness without talking about the cultural piece. And we are seeing a rise in loneliness. We're seeing how social media both serves as a form of connection that can be quite meaningful, but it also serves to create more disconnection. There's so much more ways in which we find ourselves comparing to people or wanting to show only the good of our lives. I even imagine like the difference between, let's say, you go home, you park in a driveway, and the walk from the driveway into your house, you may see your neighbor and you may have a small conversation about hydrangeas, right? And there's this like a small point of connection that gets lost if you now park your car in the driveway and go, or in your garage and go directly into your house. You know, like where are these small moments of connection and disconnection happening? It's also such a hot topic right now in terms of like working from home. There are ways in which, to go into an office means at least to have this kind of, opportunity to connect with on a more in-person basis with our coworkers. However, it comes at a tremendous cost for many of us, and it can lead us to feel even more isolated and resentful at our jobs. So there's no easy solution, I think, to the kind of growing concerns about loneliness, about the rise of the internet and social media. And I'm not really here to offer any kind of sociological solutions, but we can't talk about loneliness without the cultural piece and how it tends to exacerbate our experience of disconnect. And so in that vein, you know, loneliness can actually be an adaptive response to a society that prioritizes performance over authenticity, a society that promotes transactional relationships, a society that really devalues kind of communal living, communal relationships, ways in which we can care for each other and give to each other. But I want to now think more about loneliness as an individual, an intrapsychic experience, an individual, like what's going on for us inside of ourselves when we experience loneliness. You know, we can't, oftentimes, when we're talking about loneliness and we're talking about the sense of not feeling known, or we're talking about the sense of feeling really disconnected, we have to go back into our childhood and how early relational wounds really shape our capacity for connection. And the ways in which we were related to, the ways in which we learned how to relate to ourselves and others from a very early age is now shaping how we relate to people around us. You know, I remember having this experience in grad school, where we were invited to sit with a partner, to sit with a classmate, and to share something vulnerable of ourselves while making eye contact with the other person. And, you know, it was hard. Like it really brought up a lot. And I think about that experience to this day of like, why was that a lot? What is it about being seen that we both really want and really are terrified of? There's a Winnicott quote that I use a lot because I think it really speaks to this of like, it's a joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found, right? There are ways in which we want to hide. There are ways in which we want to separate. We want to kind of find ourselves outside of the relationship, but that's only really possible as long as we know that someone is there to look for us. Hide and seek is only fun if we know that somebody is seeking us, or else we're just hiding for the sake of hiding. And that's not what we want. And so a part of our early relational wounds can impact how seen we feel now as adults. And if we didn't feel seen then, if our caregivers were emotionally inconsistent, if they were critical or absent, we may have learned that connection is unreliable or that we have to kind of earn love. We may have now a very low capacity, actually, to be seen and held now. It may feel very threatening. It may feel scary. It may feel invasive. It may feel impinging. It may feel really terrible when someone wants to be vulnerable with us. We may kind of translate this behavior of vulnerability and kindness as unsafe or terror-filled or kind of not fun, not gratifying, not something that we want. And so that puts us in a bind. The ways in which we desperately want intimacy, we want connection, we want to feel seen and held by another person. And yet when we get it, we don't actually experience it the way we thought we would. When we get it, we experience it as impinging. You know, we experience it as being invasive. It's very interesting, for example, those of us who really consider themselves hyper-independent, the ways in which we want meaningful connection, we want to be able to depend on people. And yet when we find ourselves doing it our experience of it is we are weak. There's something wrong with us. We're going to be taken advantage of. Other people really don't have our best interests in mind. And that puts us in a bind. How do we then get the connection we want when what we do when we seek out that connection it doesn't fill us? And I think that's exactly the kind of predicament of loneliness, is that when we are experiencing loneliness, or even if it, especially if it's like a pervasive sense in our lives where we feel so not known, so kind of dropped or missed by the people around us, if it's been so kind of pervasive in our lives, part of the difficulty now is that even when someone is fully emotionally available to us, we may not be able to recognize it. We may not be able to see it. And it actually instead may feel quite dangerous and quite threatening. And it may either further validate this sense of see, I really can't trust people. So if we grew up feeling unseen, if we grew up feeling misunderstood, we may now unconsciously recreate that experience in childhood or in adulthood. We may now continually find ourselves feeling misunderstood, feeling unseen, even in the exact experience that we imagined we would actually feel very seen in. Just like that exercise in grad school, there's this person who's making eye contact with me and staring deeply into my eyes and then just listening to what I have to say. And instead of feeling this filled sense of wow, I'm feeling so seen by this person, my experience of it was why am I being it's so invasive. It's so terrifying. It's a lot. What are they even seeing of me? And are they seeing something that I don't want them to see? And I'm feeling judged, and they're not saying anything. They're just sitting there staring at me, right? And I'm having this whole internal experience. And that's the kind of difficulty about something like loneliness and all these kind of other feelings that I've been talking about in this series, is that it's not just an experience of the moment. It's not, I'm feeling lonely right now. I'm feeling lonely right now as a consequence to kind of a lifetime of feeling disconnected and unseen. And how am I now supposed to address that? It can feel really hard to know what to do with this. And so I want to ground us in two psychoanalytic thinkers who really elucidate this. Winnicott, again, the same psychoanalyst who said, it is a joy to be hidden, a disaster not to be found. He described something that he called unbearable aloneness, which is not just about being physically alone, but a profound psychic state formed early in life, often before the child has the capacity to symbolize or think about their experiences. He often talks about how important it is for a child to be able to play alone in the presence of another. And if you are a parent, I imagine that you've seen this, you've experienced the importance of this, that a kid can play, and play with his toys, want to be alone in that experience of it, but is being thought of by an adult in the room. And it happens often that what a child then does is they check in with the parents, they look at the parents, and they may even say, hey, look at this, look at this, look at this. They want to know that they're being kept in mind by the parent, but they're not saying, I want you to play with me. They're not inviting you to go into the play with them, but they just want to know that you're thinking of them. You're attuning to, you're paying attention to that. You're keeping them in mind while they are in their own psychic exploration with play. And so what happens when we don't get that? What happens when, in this example, a parent isn't paying attention on a consistent basis? Or what happens if the parent is annoyed and consistently dismissive of a kid who's asking to be played? What if the kid can only play when they are alone in their room? If they play out in the common area with their family, they get constantly judged or impinged or critiqued or told not to do that. What if every time they ask the parent to check in, the parent goes in and tries to play with them and tries to impose their rules on the play? No, don't play that way. No, why are you doing it that way? You need to be building it this way, right? And really imposing their view on the kid. So these are all different examples of a kind of a misattunement. But what happens if we do that consistently over a childhood span, right? The child starts to have this experience of unbearable aloneness, of feeling so terribly unable to imagine that there can be an adult that can keep them in mind without impinging in their play. And so then Winnicott takes it to the next step, where he talks about the fear of breakdown, which is a fear of breakdown is the fear of a breakdown that has already been experienced. And so in this idea, he points to the fact that what feels like a present crisis, like a sense of loneliness or a kind of internal collapse, is actually a resurfacing of an early unintegrated experience, often of being left emotionally alone when we were too young to bear it. So loneliness, current experience of loneliness in this sense is not new. It's a reactivation of an early state of psychic aloneness that never had the holding environment, the kind of parental mind it needed to become thinkable. Okay, so I want to break that down a little bit more. What I'm suggesting is that when we're talking about a loneliness that we're experiencing in the moment, what becomes unbearable about that loneliness? What starts to feel like there's nothing good within us? There's an emptiness. And so when I'm talking about this particular type of loneliness, I'm not talking about these kind of small moments of feeling alone or like, I really wish I could call someone to spend time with and I just don't have anyone in my life right now. I'm not talking about that type of aloneness. I'm talking about an intrapsychic, an internal experience of feeling like there is no one's mind that is thinking of me. No one knows me. No one is, no one that I know. There is no experience inside of me of a good enough other person who has been keeping me in their mind, right? So I am not known, but we may not be able to articulate it in that way. How we do articulate it is as an emptiness, a sense of feeling unloved, a sense of a tremendous amount of grief, of not really feeling like we have the types of meaningful connections we want. And what I'm suggesting is that in these moments that we're feeling this way, we're not speaking, again, to a social problem or to you need to go out and make more friends. What we're talking about is the fact that we're getting in touch with an experience from an earlier time in our lives where we did not get the type of meaningful connecting of minds that we needed in order to help us bear the unbearable, which is the experience of life, which is our suffering, which is our disappointments. Without the presence of someone to be able to make sense of these things in our childhood, we may now feel like it is continually unbearable. It's so interesting how sometimes, people will say, I'm feeling disappointed. And I don't know why that's been so scary. I don't know why I've been so afraid to feel this. Like now that I'm feeling it, it's not that big of a deal. So why have I spent my whole life being so terrified of feeling disappointed or feeling angry or feeling regret, right? Kind of the other episodes of the series. And it's like, well, maybe it's because we haven't felt like we had a container, someone to hold us while we were struggling with and feeling out these difficult feelings. And so now we feel like if we feel it, we're going to go right back in time to a point where we broke down. And it's going to feel just as disorienting now as it was then. But that's just usually not the case. We are not a child now. We have different capacities now. Another theorist that elucidates some of this is Christopher Bolas's idea of the unthought known, which describes an aspect of our early relational life that are deeply known in the body and in the psyche, but has never been verbalized or brought into conscious awareness. These unthought knowns lives in us as a kind of mute ache or as a type of like a melancholic sadness or just this like sense. I just get this sense, but I don't know why I feel this way. And so in The Shadow of the Object, Bolas writes this, he writes, the unthought known is a form of memory that has never been mentally represented, but is enacted, lived, and somatically sensed. And so when someone experiences a chronic or kind of this existential loneliness, what might be surfacing is not just a lack of connection in the present, right? We've been talking about this, but the return of something that was never fully metabolized in the past. A kind of silent knowledge that no one ever saw or held our true emotional experience. But because it happened in childhood, we don't remember it that way. We don't have a kind of memory or experience of it, but we have this embodied sense of it. We just feel disconnected. We just feel like something's missing. And this kind of loneliness, isn't cured by simply finding your people or even being more social, or getting into an intimate partnership. It asks for a different type of contact, a recognition of what went missing. Often this is what like psychoanalytic psychotherapy can offer, right? A space to feel not only seen in who you are now, but in who you were when you were most alone. We need to get into contact with the recognition of what wasn't, rather than just trying to fill the hole with something else now. There is such a pervasive fantasy with people who are single that once they get into a coupling, once they get into a relationship, they're not going to feel lonely anymore. And yet, when we talk to partnered individuals, they often say one of the more painful experiences in intimate partnership is the kind where we are in relationship with another person. They are sleeping next to us and we feel so desperately alone. There is an aloneness of being not known. There is an aloneness of an ache of something in the past. And instead of trying to fill it with more relationships, more friendships, more social contact, the invitation may be for us to spend some time mourning and getting in touch with what was missing, what we didn't get. But of course, that can feel pretty terrible and that can feel very hard, and we really can't do it alone. And so we defend against it, right? How often have we found ourselves defending against loneliness? And we defend against loneliness in many different ways. We withdraw. If I'm not in any relationship or if I'm not in contact with anybody, then I won't be in touch with the aloneness. I may be alone, but I won't be in touch with my loneliness, because part of the being alone, being lonely is knowing there is an absence. There's an emptiness. And so the fantasy goes that if we're not in a container at all, then we can't feel emptiness, Just like if we don't turn on the light, we really can't see the shadows. There's no contrast. Part of what we're talking about here in the loneliness is a contrast, a way in which we needed something and we didn't get it, an emptiness, an absence. Yeah. So we withdraw, or, we overwork. We just focus on something we can control. We devote ourselves to our careers. We, kind of push ourselves through over-exercising. We really try to contort our bodies to fit more socially accepted physical looks. So, right, trying to do something here. We may have these fantasies of like, I'm alone because I'm ugly. And if I were smarter or if I were more successful, then people would want to really get to know me. And so we then try to focus on these things in a very obsessive way. There's people pleasing, which is a great way that we try to defend against loneliness because it's so subtle. We think we're doing it because we want connection. We think we're people pleasing because we want to not feel lonely. But what we're actually doing is perpetuating the loneliness, because so much of people pleasing is a mask, is a way that we're trying to fool people into loving us. Not for who we are, not for our vulnerabilities, but because we are who we think they want us to be. It's like a huge act. And of course, it leaves us more and more separate from ourselves and leaves us then feeling more and more lonely. So that's all of these defenses, right? The kind of difficulty of them is that the more we defend against the loneliness, the more lonely we become. And then there's over intellectualizing, if we kind of know ourselves so deeply, then we won't feel alone. We can get really hyperfixated on reading all the books, improving ourselves, right? And if we kind of really can become more perfect, then we won't feel so alone, right? There's all these kind of to-dos. If we just to-do these things, if we just be better, then why wouldn't we be known? And again, it's really a tricky, defense, because there is such a seduction in it that there is something we can do to not feel so alone. And it's to just improve ourselves or to be different. And that can feel like we're moving towards something. But of course, the very act of doing the thing of changing ourselves out of this place of defending against loneliness, we're actually in some ways moving further and further away from ourselves. One defense that we tend to see often, of course, of people who are terrified of loneliness or terrified of bearing the aloneness that they actually feel is that they just can never be alone, and they just are always surrounded by people. And there's a way in which we can really lose ourselves in these relationships. And like, just if we're just always texting people and always calling people and always hanging out with people, then we can't ever really be alone, because the minute that we're alone, we get overwhelmed with loneliness. This is such a great example of the fact that maybe this loneliness that we're talking about is not going to be filled through social interactions. If we are so terrified of being alone, because the minute we're alone, we're left with our thoughts, we're left with our feelings. Or one of the things that we may be really struggling with there is that we're left with our own anxieties about aloneness, about loneliness, about being forced to bear what could not be bared at a time when we really struggled with mentalization and symbolic thinking. So what's going on there, right? Like, why do some of us feel lonelier in relationships than when we are alone? These individuals, right, may find themselves avoiding relationships because even being in relationship and all its relational complexities doesn't alleviate the loneliness. And then it really can exacerbate the feeling of like, oh my gosh, if I'm like literally in a relationship and I still feel this way, what hope do I have for myself? And there's a cycle, right, of seeking validation, wanting the other person to let them know that they're known, right? Wanting like affirmation, like see me, right? But also at the same time fearing vulnerability. Like that example of me in grad school and making contact, like that type of vulnerability of being really seen can feel really terrible, because what are they seeing? And we're having a hard time imagining they could love us or that they're seeing something wonderful in us. And so it sets us up this cycle of like longing for closeness while staying kind of emotionally guarded. And when we are emotionally guarded or emotionally distant from ourselves or from people, what we're going to find is that we may be in relationship with people and still feel terribly alone. There's a way in which being not alone, not lonely, is an active process. But many of us want it to be a passive process. We want to just be in the right relationship. And if we're in the right relationship, people will know us and see us, and then we will feel connected. And the work then is in the other person. If it's the right person, they'll be able to just see us. And this passivity speaks to, again, what we didn't get and should have gotten, because it is a passive experience for children. It's not a child's job, like a 5-year-old, to help an adult see them, right? It's really on the adult, the parents, the caregivers, the people in this kid's life. It's their job to hold the child in mind, to be thinking about the child, to be attuned to the child and doing that work. It is for children a more passive experience of navigating connection. But now as adults, if we're still finding ourselves in this kind of passive stance of if it's the right relationship, they'll just see and understand me, we're really missing out on the fact that to be seen is actually a very active experience, a very active process. So, of course, the tricky thing is about relationships is that being in relationship gives us a sense of potential, that this could be the right person, that this could be the person who's going to finally see us. And then there's also the kind of anticipatory disappointment of, and they're probably not, because it had never really been seen. So they're probably not going to be seen. And that whole dynamic can feel really, really painful. So it's probably better to just not be in relationship at all. It's kind of like, I think, if we know that our friends are all spending time together and that we're not invited, that feels in some ways even more painful than they're all spending time together and we don't know, because the knowing that there are people out there and they're doing things and we're not invited to is part of what hurts. So knowing that there could be someone out there that could see us and then not feeling seen can sometimes feel even more painful than just being alone. And so we try to justify our aloneness. We try to say, I don't want relationships anyway, or I'd rather be single. Relationships bring all sorts of complicated feelings. I don't need people. I'm going to be hyper independent. But of course, that doesn't address the loneliness. But it can it can help us be defended against it, right? We don't have to be in touch with that type of loneliness if there's no one around us who could potentially give it and could potentially take away. The reason why I wanted to record this whole podcast episode on loneliness is because I've also been thinking about loneliness as a kind of experience of grief. Sometimes loneliness is a communication of grief, an unconscious experience of loss, of a connection that we crave, deserve, and never had. And so in that sense, loneliness, again, is not just about being alone, but really missing something that we never had. And so I wrote about this on Instagram, and I want to read to you what I wrote. I wrote, loneliness is not always about who is missing now, but what was never there. Sometimes loneliness is grief in disguise, a silent mourning for the attunement we longed for but never received, the embrace that never came, the presence we learned to live without. It is the echo of a connection we deserved, but were taught to survive without. So psychoanalysis tells us that loneliness is not just an absence, it's an unconscious experience of loss, a longing for something we cannot name yet feel in our bones. And perhaps the hardest part is that we are not just grieving another, we are grieving the version of ourselves who should have been held and didn't. What if, instead of resisting loneliness, we listened to what it is trying to tell us? What if we made space for the grief beneath it? Because what was never given can still be reclaimed, and what was once missing can still be found, but it's not going to be the way that we thought it was going to be. There's, the kind of passive experience of being seen is not now possible in adulthood because we're now adults. And our partner, it's a big, gargantuous task to assign our partners to be the parents we didn't have. That's just not possible in partnership. Our partners are not our parents. And so there is a grieving. Part of the process of re-relating or changing our relationship to loneliness and potentially alchemizing it is being able to be present with the grief that comes with loneliness for what we didn't get and should have gotten. There is a gift in this, in seeing that this disconnection is really in the past. And that there is now something we can do to move towards more meaningful connection. We don't have to passively hope that people can see us, can know us, can hold us in mind. Yeah. And so what loneliness might be asking of us is that, it is inviting us to listen to ourselves, that it's a form of communication. It's not pathology. It's really not a sign that there actually is something wrong with us, but rather an invitation to understand something of what was not there and what we need now. The fantasy that, if we now get perfect attunement is just not connected to the reality of our relational lives. We will never get what we didn't get. We can get it differently though now. And in some ways it's better the way it is now because it's not coming out of a compensation of the past, but a gift of the present. And that is the role that mourning needs to take, the role that mourning can take for us in making room for new capacities and new abilities to be seen and recognized and held in mind by another. Mourning and grief is such it's such an important aspect of therapy and of making space for something new. We really can't create space for something new until we recognize and face and process what we didn't get. Because if we're not processing it, that unconscious material is going to be taking up the space, and we may not even know it. Our unconscious life is with us, and it is always with us. And if we're not recognizing it or naming it or exploring it, then it doesn't mean that it's not taking up a lot of space and not informing our decisions and not informing the ways that we are seeing and relating to other people. And so making space for us to explore how our unconscious life is showing up in our loneliness and in our ability to be seen and our desire to be seen is going to be really important, right? And part of that is also in the morning, being able to be with the loss of what we didn't get. And therapeutic intimacy becomes a site of reworking this isolation. And it's similar, it's what Christopher Bolas said. It's not, now you have a therapist, now you're not going to feel lonely. It's that now in therapy, we get to hold the loneliness and get to bring name. We get to bring words. We get to bring understanding of this loneliness, of this emptiness, and we can make space for something different. So, one thing that has helped me in kind of being with some of my loneliness in my move, in my transition, in making new relationships and the kind of all the complexities that come from it is when I feel so alone, when I'm feeling so lonely, I find it helpful to ask, what am I feeling so alone with? What is the feeling that I'm having a hard time imagining that someone could bear witness to? Right? What is the experience of the emptiness? What is feeling empty? What is wanting to be held? And that can help me give some shape and some name and some articulation to this experience internally that can make it all a bit more bearable. And then the other kind of real important part of addressing loneliness, this existential loneliness, is really looking into how we are assuming that people won't understand without giving them an opportunity to understand. How may we be in our assumption of loneliness, defending against vulnerability and our own authentic truths, where we may be putting a false mask to the world about who we are, and then feeling the emptiness and the loneliness as a consequence of it. Because we can't ever really be fully seen if we are always wearing a mask. At some point, we're going to have to become more of ourselves in the work of addressing the loneliness. So cultivating self-trust, cultivating a sense of our own minds, being able to bear and tolerate ourselves is going to be a really instrumental part of addressing the loneliness. Yeah. So that's all I have about loneliness for this episode. I'm going to do a whole other episode on loneliness and the worthiness wound, because I do find that they tend to go hand in hand. And I have a lot more thoughts there, but I'm going to do that in a different episode. So stay tuned for that. And the kind of invitation I think I want to leave everybody with is like to, spend some time reflecting on your own loneliness. And, this is a kind of gentle reminder that you're not broken. You are responding to something deep. You're responding to something that wasn't there. And the more we can understand what wasn't there and kind of allow the loneliness to inform us of what may be missing, the better off we are in our ability to then address it and to be able to hold it. Okay. So thank you so much for listening. I know this isn't necessarily the kind of easiest topic, but it's been near and dear to my heart. And I hope that this is useful for you in holding your own pain a little bit more gently. And I will catch you on the next episode.